You are welcome here. You're welcome here just as you are. Of the many words that I speak throughout the days of awe, and by the end I will have spoken a lot of words. I think the words I just spoke are the most important, and sometimes the most difficult to hear. And they are not words that are unique to the days of awe or even Yom Kippur. They are words that I say almost every time that we gather as a community. Sometimes I fear I sound like a broken record. But every time I say it, I genuinely mean it. And I know that there may be someone new in the room for whom it is their first time hearing these words. And I also know that many of us need to hear them over and over again. For many of us, it is hard to believe that one could possibly be welcomed in a religious and spiritual community just as they are. So let me say it again. You are welcome here, just as you are. I'm also aware how risky these words are, because they have the potential to communicate a universal welcome, as though there are no boundaries to this community or no shared commitments that define who we are and what we believe, which is not the case. And yet I keep saying them because these words are attempting to communicate a kind of belonging that so many of us long for, but have not or do not feel. For many of us, this goes against both the direct and the indirect messages we received in our most formative years, not just in religious spaces, but perhaps also in religious spaces. And I imagine that even as I speak these words, some people here are thinking that parts of them are exempt from this radical welcome. I assure you, that is not the case. But I can begin to imagine why you might feel that way. I am not a joiner by nature. I am not generally good at going with the flow. I don't like sleepovers unless it's a very familiar place, and probably not even then. I can barely sleep at my parents' house where I grew up. I am forever trying to be more flexible and easygoing, to trust that I will be able to get my needs met in any given situation. I am not good at traveling to places I haven't been before, to trust that if I show up somewhere, I will feel seen and safe in my body. I am forever shedding my childhood identity of being the difficult child. And yet I feel called to extend this radical welcome to you over and over again, year after year, because being part of the Kol Tzedek community is one of my most important spiritual practices. It has taught me how to be vulnerable, how risky, and how healing joining is. What holds us back is often directly correlated to the many layers of identity we each hold that may not be easily seen, appreciated, or respected in communal space. And I do not take that for granted. But I also must credit my teacher, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who modeled this radical welcome for me when I was her student at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah. You are welcome here if you came here alone tonight, or if you came with your family. You're welcome here if this is your first Yom Kippur or your 70th. You're welcome here whether or not you know the prayers. You are welcome here whether or not you feel represented on the bima. You are welcome here if this is your first time at Kol Tzedek, or if you come here every week. I feel especially compelled to speak to this tonight, on this Kol Nidre, when we are our widest web, because this is a moment of not only personal transformation, but also collective. We are once again reimagining and reconstituting ourselves. We are, for the first time, having truly hybrid Yamim Noraim services, attempting to create community across time and space in important and difficult ways. This is a fragile and complicated moment to be a community, and we need to be mindful of how we move forward together. I want to begin by sharing one of my most favorite stories from the Talmud, the story that most animates my rabbinate and now appears at the top of our community's vision statement. It was taught that on the day that they removed Rabban Gamliel as head of the house of study and appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah in his place, permission was granted for all of the students who wanted to enter. Bo bayom, on that very day, hundreds of benches were added to the Beit Midrash. Some say 300 benches, others say 700. Ever since I learned this text, I have remained captivated by the image of rows upon rows of once alienated, now eager learners, unlocking the mysteries of our sacred texts. I personally owe a debt of gratitude to so many generations before me who have undermined authority figures to add benches to our houses of worship and study. But you may be asking, why did they need to remove Rabban Gamliel as head of the yeshiva? Why had he kept out all of those seemingly eager learners? The Talmud explains, Shehaya Rabban Gamliel machriz ve'omer, that Rabban Gamliel used to be strident and say, Kol tamid she'ein tocho kevaro, lo yikanes leveit midrash. That any student whose insides did not match their outsides could not enter the Beit Midrash, the house of study. Which is to say that Rabban Gamliel had a litmus test for who was welcome to come into the Beit Midrash and who was not. You were not welcome just as you were. Now, as a teacher of Torah, I try to stress, as my teachers stressed, the importance of having both a generous and a critical read of every text. So let's start with the generous read. Perhaps Rabban Gamliel was looking for students whose actions aligned with their ideas. Students who had what we might call integrity. Isn't this what we are trying to do on Yom Kippur?
Yes.
To be people, thank you, Koach. To be the people on the inside that we purport to be on the outside. To align our thoughts and our actions so that we can live our lives with integrity. Perhaps we too can imagine the longing to have our insides match our outsides. And yet, every time I read this line in the story, I feel utterly alienated. As a trans person, I do not know what it would even mean for my insides to match my outsides. But I do know that is not how I feel, or how I move through the world, or how the world moves through me. I know so many of us hold complex layers of identity, some more visible than others. We hold experiences of immigration, ethnicity, and trauma, chronic illness, anxiety, and depression. Each of these experiences permeate and define our internal experiences, but may not be visible or apparent on the outside. So many of us are wrestling with our insides. We are hurting and healing. We are longing to feel safe and at home in this world. We are longing to feel safe and at home in our bodies. What would it even mean for our insides to match our outsides? And who would be the judge of that? Now, looking out this evening, it's clear to me that we are a community that keeps adding rows upon rows of benches. Rows upon rows of benches with people of all stripes, including those of us who have previously been kept out of religious communities, including those of us who have felt unable to bring our full self to the Jewish community. I am especially grateful for the pillars of this particular community who have built this ever-expanding spiritual home, who were fearless in their vision and persistent in their building. The story of Rabban Gamliel is an invitation for all of us to see ourselves as insiders to Jewish tradition, I think it is why the founders built Kol Tzedek the way they did. Now, this is not an easy transformation. I am not sure if Rabban Gamliel would have welcomed us into his house of study. But we don't have to wonder. Because our sages decided thousands of years ago that this could not be the sole rubric by which to measure belonging. It is as if the sages of the Talmud are reaching across thousands of years and many generations to say to us tonight, you are welcome here, just as you are. We threw open the gates then so that you could enter the gates now. The sentiment of these words is not just captured in this story, nor it is limited to the house of study. It actually is a refrain in Jewish prayer as well. If you turn to page 148, if you turn to page 148 in your Machzor, you will see that every morning as we prepare to say the Shema, whether on Shabbat, Yom Kippur, or a random weekday, we invoke the great expansive love of the Holy One, Ahava Rabbah. And in it we sing, Velo nevosh, velo nikalem, velo nikashel, leolam va'ed. That we should not feel shame or humiliation or falter because of who we are. This is a core Jewish teaching in prayer, that we should not be ashamed of ourselves, that we are welcome and loved just as we are. It is not an accident that we find this sentiment as we prepare for a moment of collective unity embedded in the Shema. I honestly feel teary every time we sing these words at Kol Tzedek B'nai Mitzvah. I think about each of the young Jewish adults finding their way in the world, that they should not feel ashamed or embarrassed to be Jewish, to be who they are on so many levels. They stand at such a fragile and formative time in their lives. Velo nevosh, that they should not feel shame. I remember my own B'nai Mitzvah, my own awkward, closeted teenage self, feeling so much shame and fear about the person I was becoming. I'm so abundantly grateful to my teachers and rabbis, especially Rabbi Karen Bender, who was in the first generation of lesbian rabbis. Her presence made me feel at home in the walls of my synagogue from such a young age in the way that no one else could. There is no doubt that I am a rabbi, at least in part because of her. I can remember like it was yesterday, sitting in a Dunkin' Donuts with my fellow youth group presidents, planning the annual Purim Carnival. That might have been my first synagogue committee. It is certainly not a coincidence that several of us at that Dunkin' Donuts went on to become queer rabbis.
L'chaim.
L'chaim to that. But it is not just a core Jewish tenet that we shouldn't feel shame for who we are. The rabbis also stress that we shouldn't bring shame upon each other. In fact, when they define what it means for a person to cause another person harm, they articulate 5 categories of harm. Hachovel b'chaveiro chayav alav mishum chamisha devarim. When a person injures another person, they are responsible to compensate them for 5 types of harm. Benezek, for physical damages. Bitsa'ar, for pain. Beripui, for their medical costs. Beshevet, for their loss of livelihood, so to speak, their sick time. Uboshet, for the humiliation and shame that they were caused. The first 4 types of harm are relatively concrete. There is some way to measure them, even if it is ultimately subjective. As the one who caused injury, you are responsible for the actual damage, for the pain a person experiences as a result of the harm, for the doctor's bills, and the time the injured party couldn't work. For each of these 4 kinds of harm, the rabbis ask, how is the damage assessed? In other words, how does one know how much they owe if they cause injury to another? And then for each of these 4 kinds of harm, the rabbis spend many pages figuring this out. If we had longer, I would share them all with you. But the 5th type of harm, boshet, which means humiliation or shame, the harm we cause someone when we shame them, is considered an emotional consequence that is understood by our sages to be worthy of compensation, but much harder to assess than the other categories. The Mishnah states, boshet, in the case of humiliation, how should they be compensated? Hakol lefi hamevayesh v'hamitbayesh. How is payment for humiliation assessed? It all depends on who is humiliated and it all depends on who humiliates and who is humiliated. Which is to say, it is entirely personal and subjective, though no less real. The rabbis take shame very seriously. They even articulate the difference between shame caused by an action or a physical injury and shame that is caused by words. Shame that is caused by words falls into the category of harm called ona'at devarim, literally the harm we cause with our words or through our words. There are all sorts of wise and practical teachings that emerge here. If you find yourself perusing in a shop, don't ask the merchant how much something costs unless you're really planning to buy it. Which is to say, don't get their hopes up and disappoint them. That's a kind of ona'at devarim, a kind of harm we can cause with the simple words of, how much is this? If a person has done tshuva for something they did wrong, don't remind them, hey, remember when you did such and such a thing? Which is to say, we should not remind people of their past wrongdoings because they're in a process of growing and changing, which is, after all, why we're here tonight. Yes. Lest we invoke the shame they feel for having done what they've already done tshuva for. If a person is the child of someone who has converted to Judaism, don't invoke their ancestors in order to point out that their parents' status was people who converted to Judaism. Which is to say, don't bring up sensitive truths about other people without their consent. The Talmud even warns against calling someone by a derogatory nickname, even if they consent to it, lest we reinforce the shame and pain that a person has become accustomed to and underestimate the unconscious psychical and spiritual impact of that derogatory nickname. What I love about each of these examples is how different they are from each other, and how relatable, how practical, how often they occur. There are so many subtle and common ways that we cause each other harm through our words, bizadon ubishgaga, whether on purpose or by accident. This is something I have learned I need to be extra mindful of. As an extrovert, I am likely to share something about a friend or my partner or one of my kids that they would actually have preferred to have kept private. I have learned how embarrassing this can be. I often do this to connect in conversation, but end up causing someone I love harm. The rabbis explain that when we harm each other with words, it actually impacts our entire beings and our bodies. They note that if we steal money from someone, we can always repay it. We can always return it. But it is much harder to actually repair the harm we cause one another with our words. This is why so much of the collective vidui on Yom Kippur is actually about the impact of words and speech. Al chet shechatanu lefanecha bedibur peh. For the wrong we have done before you through the words that we speak. Ve'al chet shechatanu lefanecha belashon hara. And for the wrong we have done before you through harmful speech. The rabbis feel so strongly about how much harm we can cause each other with our words that they even go so far as to say, that to humiliate a person in public is akin to murder. Kol hamalbin pnei chaveiro berabim ki'ilu shofech damim. Quoting, any person who humiliates another in public, it is as if they spilled their blood. They explain that when a person is humiliated, they tend to blush, growing red in the cheeks. But when the red leaves and their face turns white with embarrassment, it is as though you spilled their blood, because it drains from their face. Not only that, but for the rabbis to insult a person in public or to call them a derogatory name is akin to humiliation. It's considered the same. And lest we think it's just with our words, the rabbis actually create a category called avak lashon hara, the dust of our harmful speech, the essence, the gesture of it. We can cause such harm with our body language, our eye rolls, our social media reactions, even our emojis that roll eyes. And so we return each morning, lo nevosh, velo nikalem, velo nikashel leolam ve'ed. We should not feel ashamed. We should not cause shame. We should not falter in this world. We are at once reminded to not feel ashamed of who we are and to not cause others shame. We are invited to be who we are and to create a space where we can each be who we are together. This takes practice. To quote the poet and disability justice activist Laura Hershey, may her memory be a blessing, "Amen. You get proud by practicing." She writes, "If you are not proud for who you are, for what you say, for how you look, if every time you stop to think of yourself, you do not see yourself glowing with golden light, do not therefore give up on yourself. You can get proud. You do not need a better body, a purer spirit, or a PhD to be proud. You do not need a lot of money, or a handsome boyfriend, or a nice car. You do not need to be able to walk, or see, or hear, or use big complicated words, or quote passages of the Talmud, or do any of those things that you just can't do. A caseworker cannot make you proud. A doctor cannot make you proud. You only need more practice. You get proud by practicing. And our liturgy actively invites us into this practice. In the same series of blessings leading up to the Shema, there is a preliminary Kedusha, a moment of angelic holiness that Rabbi Mo and I have been studying all year together. You'll see it on page 142. It's a section that we have historically skipped on Shabbat mornings to conserve time. But in recent months, we decided that we needed the practice. The prayer describes the angels singing in awestruck unison, V'chulam mekablim alehem ol malchut shemayim ze mizeh, v'notnim be'ahava reshut ze lazeh. And they take upon themselves to find a way into relationship with the divine, and then they all lovingly give each other permission to do the same. Which is to say, the angels are trying to create a sacred community where they can connect to each other and to God, fully and wholly. We remind ourselves of this every time we say the Shema, so that we too can create the kind of community where we lovingly give each other permission to be our full selves and to know the Holy One. This requires so much care, so much bravery, and so much mindfulness. The Rabban Gamliel story allows us to have compassion for ourselves. The Talmud says that on that day, on the day in which they removed the gatekeeper to the Beit Midrash, they figured out all of the existing thorny halachic issues. But you have to imagine that adding 700 benches in one fell swoop meant they had a whole bunch of new stuff to figure out, too. Opening the doors means that the community includes new perspectives, new experiences, new situations that it hasn't dealt with before. There are going to be great discoveries and innovations. There is going to be so much healing, so many chiddushes, and so many bumps in the road. As the benches of this community keep growing, I have learned that it is not enough to just throw open the doors and undo the decree of Rabban Gamliel. It may not be that our insides need to match our outsides, but we do need a shared rubric for how we understand ourselves and how we relate to one another. It is sweet to imagine that in the yeshiva shel mata, here in the earthly realm, we say to each other, "You are welcome here just as you are." And in the yeshiva shel mala, which we invoked earlier, in the heavenly realm, the angels are saying it to one another. This Yom Kippur, I invite us to get a little closer to that heavenly reciprocity. The story of Rabban Gamliel is an invitation to see ourselves as insiders. And with this shift in self-perception comes an important shift in responsibility. We are each powerful and important members of this community. Our presence, our actions, our words have the power to lovingly give each other permission and the power to cause harm and shame. V'chulam mekablim alehem v'reshut ze lazeh. As a community, we are taking responsibility and inviting each other into practice new ways of being together. Which is why this past June, after 3 years of community conversation and process, we adopted a community brit, which articulates shared values for how we want to be in community with one another. You can find it after the holiday at koltzedek.org/values. It begins with gratitude to Tanya Isaac. How we relate to one another and embody our values is the foundation of transformation for ourselves and the world. How we relate to one another and embody our values is the foundation of transformation for ourselves and the world. The 10 values that follow are meant to support us individually and collectively in ways that will encourage our shared dignity and protect us from shame and disgrace. Lo nevosh, velo nikalem, velo nikashel, leolam va'ed. There is no sense that any of us individually or that we collectively are perfect. That is not what it means to be welcome here fully. We are instead invited to bring our full, imperfect, evolving, growing, awakening selves to this community. There is comfort and discomfort in this way of being together. Yom Kippur is an important support system for creating this kind of sacred community. The very fact that we need to do tshuva is not intended to cause shame, though it often does. It is part of what it means to be human. In the words of Brené Brown, shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. Shame corrodes the very part of us that believes we are capable of change. Yom Kippur is not a giant shame spiral. It is a safety net. It is the antidote to shame. It is meant to unstuck us. It is said that when an individual calls out in tshuva, sometimes the Holy One listens. But when a community calls out together, the Holy One always listens. So this Yom Kippur, we are inviting each other in and giving each other permission to be fully human, to be open to change, to be willing to forgive and apologize as a way to begin again together. Sabine Selassie, a self-identified, nerdy, black, immigrant, tomboy, Buddhist weirdo, her words, not mine, wrote a new book entitled You Belong. In it, she writes, Belonging happens through the body. When we feel belonging, there's an ease that is palpable, like feeling a deep exhale or the release of vigilance. So as we prepare in a moment to recite the prayers of forgiveness, in which we will call out collectively the ways we have missed the mark, I want to take notice that we invite each other the protection of our collective voices of this community. And I want to invite you to take a moment to close your eyes and connect to your body. To breathe deeply and to exhale slowly. To remember that you were made in the image of the divine, and to send the message that you belong to every cell in your body. I want to invite you to release your vigilance. This Yom Kippur, may we have the courage and the compassion to give each other permission to be fully human, to celebrate our insides and our outsides, and to protect each other and ourselves from shame and disgrace. Gemar Chatima Tova. May we be sealed for a year of life and a year of goodness.
Amen.